First, I'd just like to say what an honor it is for me to be here, to be able to address this group. So I thank you for the invitation and also for the time and attention that you'll provide me over the next several minutes. I'm humbled by the introductions that the Senator and Michael gave me in terms of my crystal ball, my capacity to look into the future and to be able to make sense of that future in a way that is actionable for policymakers or business leaders. When I hear this introduction, I'm reminded of a joke from my profession that says, I'll pretend to know and you can pretend to believe me. So I think if you take that as the first words of caution, you'll probably be in a good position. I can only provide a single perspective, and that is one from an American who has spent 30 years in the United States intelligence community, who spent most of that time in jobs that were focused on the future, trying to identify events, whether they're opportunities or challenges, threats that haven't materialized yet, but that could materialize. I want to talk about two things tonight. The first is really echoing some of the comments that we've heard so far about what a complex world we live in. In most professions, if you spend 30 years in the profession, you would like to think at the end of your career, you knew more and understood more than you did when you started out. I would say for me, I can't make that statement. I understand less about this complex, tumultuous world we live in the world that I see emerging, than I did in the old days when I started and I could just focus on the Soviet Union and the security threat posed by that state and its alliance. So please, as I go through this, understand that I'm providing a perspective. I hope it's useful, and we can see in the discussions what questions you have. The second thing I wanted to do was talk to you about a strategic framework for being able to understand and generate options to deal with change. So I'll do that in the second part of my presentation. I thought I would start by putting myself back in my government position. I retired a year and a half ago, and providing for you a short overview, as I would for senior U.S. leaders if I was still in my last position, of the kinds of threats and challenges that I see emerging over the next 12 months or so. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time explaining the details of why I put the states or the issues that I did on this list. Again, we can save some of that for question and answer. In the interest of time, I want to go through it pretty quickly. I'm very concerned about the situations in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially with the drawdown of U.S. forces and allied forces from Iraq. I think there's tremendous challenges facing that country, and I can see many scenarios in which the situation and the democratic experiment there goes wrong in ways that have significance for any globally engaged nation or organization. Afghanistan, we all know, is in a precarious state right now in any number. I consider it almost at a tipping point to some degree. I believe progress is being made. You can point to that progress, but we are by no means out of the woods there yet. I worry a lot about what I would call rogue states, especially Iran and North Korea, might do in a sudden way to change the strategic dynamic in their region and perhaps with global implications. For Iran, I would look at, I looked at things that center around their nuclear program and look for surprises from the state of that nuclear program, how far advanced it might be, and what Iran might do in response to the recent IAEA report, which was more conclusive, short of saying that Iran has a weapons program. I think Iran will react to this, and especially to the option of increased or more stringent sanctions. North Korea, lots of potential for surprise there from an aging leader who has known nothing but a dictatorship and is trying to turn over the succession process for power to his son, who might not have acceptance across that Korean security elite. Lots of instances where I could see instability becoming an event almost overnight that we have to deal with. I've listed a number of countries here. It's not a complete list, but I would argue that instability is a potential possibility in all of those areas, and if it did occur, it could be consequential. Of course, terrorism is something that we all need to pay attention to. I look at the successes that we have had as an alliance, as a group of nations across the world combating this threat. But I also know there is a lot we don't know. It's a very difficult challenge from a security perspective to provide the kind of precise warning that allows action to be taken ahead of time. So we have to keep very vigilant for as far as I can see into the future against this threat, and especially against how it might evolve in terms of attack methods, targets, goals and motivations that might change the way it operates. It will adapt to the world that is changing. It is adapting to our counterterrorism measures. Several times already tonight we've mentioned cyber. This is a threat that is large at this point, potentially larger in the future. We in the West especially are dependent on information technology. That technology at once makes us more productive, interdependent, but also in some ways vulnerable. I haven't seen yet the large-scale criminal use of this kind of technology, but that would be a potential concern beyond just the state actor use or terrorist use. In terms of regional conflict, probably my largest concern would be something involving Israeli military action against the Iranian nuclear threat. I believe that would have implications beyond that region that would probably last beyond even this 12-month period, should that kind of exchange between Israel and Iran occur. Other places where I think you have large forces in close proximity across a tense line of control would be places like India, Pakistan, to a lesser degree Russia, Georgia, but we have experienced conflict there already. Very worried as I look at Sudan and South Sudan, maybe something that initially would be more limited implications, but I think given that South Sudan is the newest state, and we've just ended through a long period of negotiation, a very costly and brutal conflict in Sudan, and given the border states around Sudan, I would put that on my list. We had a military incident earlier within the last few days where a NATO operation killed 24 Pakistani soldiers inadvertently. You can see what that's done in terms of U.S.-Pakistani relations. I think those kinds of things are especially a constant concern where forces are engaged in combat. But they're also a concern in places like the South China Sea, where there are multiple competing claims over the resources and the territory under the water. I would say the Eastern Mediterranean, I would worry about potential inadvertent or partially inadvertent clashes between, say, Israel and a Turkey. The United States and China went through one of these, if you recall, in the first years of the second Bush administration. So these are constantly something that is a potential that you have to be thinking through. How would I manage this if it involved my forces or some allied force? And of course, I don't need to convince anyone here about the danger of economic crisis or a broader economic implication of what's happening here, what's happening in my country, what's happening in much of the developed world regarding economic issues. So that would be a short list of concerns that I would want to be alert to. I would want to be thinking, if I were an organization, whether it's a department or a nation or a large corporate entity, I would want to be thinking, how, if these things occurred, might I react to them? How would I limit or mitigate the consequences for me and my organization? I'll switch for a second to describe what I see are some of the longer-term issues that are driving change in this global security environment. So these are the forces, the factors, the trends that I think are most important. I'm going to highlight those for you. Again, you could get into long, detailed lists. You could provide an evening's briefing on this. So I will move rather quickly through them. I think the point that I would like to make is that change is probably the only constant as I think about the future security environment. You can try to avoid change. You can try to ignore change. I think the strategy is to prepare for change, to expect it, to embrace it, anticipate it, and be in a better position when it actually arrives. Let me just say there are some things that I am much more certain about than others, and this list, I think, is not very controversial. But from my perspective, we are already in a more multipolar world, especially when compared to the immediate post-Cold War period when the U.S. was more of a unipolar power. We're clearly seeing a shift in wealth in two ways. One, from energy-dependent states that are paying for especially fossil fuels, and tremendous transfer of wealth from those states to the energy-producing states. There's also this tremendous shift from what I would say west to east, with the rise especially of India and China as major global economic players. I would put Brazil in that category also. That's more of a southern transfer. But there is this, and I will talk about it later, technological change, the pace of technology, the global proliferation of technology, its availability, the ubiquitousness of it to anyone is a constant, I believe. It's fashionable now, at least in my country, to think of the U.S. as a declining power. We'll see where we end up from that perspective. But I would say economic, military, idea, kind of cultural influence-wise, at least for the 10 to 20-year period that I'm addressing here, the U.S. remains uniquely capable and important as a global actor. I don't see how we have less pressure on global resources, given what I expect in terms of at least emerging market economy growth. Overall, I see an environment enabled by globalization that is more conducive to conflict, not necessarily large-scale war, but the kind of political conflict that we see playing out in places like the Middle East and North Africa today. And demographic trends, graying, aging populations in much of the northern hemisphere, expanding, in some cases rapidly expanding populations in other areas of the world. the implications of these trends are what's important to try to think through and sort out. I won't go down everything on the less certain list. I'm not saying that I'm uncertain that climate change is an issue. What's uncertain about it is what we collectively are willing to do with respect to climate change and how effective those actions are, how much time we actually have. I do think we have a number of states that are struggling with the democratic process as part of the Arab Spring, but then also in some of the states I list here. And I wonder whether our Western leadership in individual states and collectively is up to these challenges. And if it's not, what that portends for the future. I do believe we're in a period of prolonged transition. I would just say a couple of things here. From my way of thinking, this is as large a transition, as much turmoil as at any time since the end of the Second World War. I don't see, because of the dimensions being political, economic, social, technological, military, cultural, I don't see that they can be slowed or reversed anytime soon, no matter what we think in terms of powers or conditions or circumstances. So again, for me, this change is going to affect any globally engaged. I would say even beyond that, it's going to affect, if you're alive on the planet, this kind of change affects you. One dimension of it is the changing global power landscape. I look at India and China and their rise, and I think of the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, the equivalent rise of the United States as a global player, Germany as a united global player, Japan. Now we can all think of that kind of dynamic, that kind of new power emergence onto the international scene, and we can think of the history of the 20th century and 2 world wars. I don't argue that it has to turn out that way. I would just say that the power dynamic and the change that we are witnessing is of that magnitude. At a minimum, it means we have to redefine the concepts, the metrics, the strategies, the way we think about the international security environment, even the terms we use of first world, third world, north, south. I believe all of those can stand revision. The graphic is just trying to emphasize the point by showing when China and India, about a quarter of the world's population, using purchasing power parity comparisons, when their economies actually have already or will overtake the traditional large, powerful Western, mostly, economies. I don't think this has to be a bad thing, but in the past, in history, this kind of economic power has implications for global security. These are Goldman Sachs projections. You can argue with where and when exactly, but the trend, I think, is not arguable. We also see, at the sub-state level, the growing influence of a number of actors. And at least in my community, our capacity to understand and engage, take on and deal with these kinds of organizations, with the traditional levers and means and organizations that we have in our government, it's a challenge. So, if you're on the planet, I think you have to be thinking strategically about how do I deal with this dynamism? It will affect me. Globalization, I don't see anything that reverses that trend. When I refer to globalization, I'm thinking of money, people, information, technology, ideas, disease, for good and bad, moving around the world at higher rates of speed, less limited by either man-made or geographical boundaries or borders. You can argue about whether this can be reversed. I think some aspects of it can't be, especially the technology-driven aspects of how we're all interconnected. I believe globalization is linked to a global expanding economy related to expanding trade, to the interdependence of economies, to the interdependence of global finances. You might say that if you had a global recession or depression, that would retard some aspects of globalization. I could also see where a global pandemic that really reached historic kinds of proportions could at least temporarily retard globalization. I think the issue here for me is that the benefits of globalization aren't global, that we have to be able individually and collectively to deal with the negative aspects without undermining the positive aspects. And again, for me, that's a challenge to strategic planning. It's a challenge to our institutions, to our leadership. Governments everywhere, I believe, are facing challenges that perhaps 10 to 15 years ago they did not face. I've mentioned some of them in terms of globalization, demographics, and technology. I mentioned that the demographics kind of, in a broad sense, you look at an aging northern hemisphere and a younger, more dynamic in terms of population trends, southern hemisphere. I do worry that in many cases, the infrastructure, the education system, the leadership, the opportunities available to these young, growing populations won't be able to satisfy them, won't be able to fully employ them. And so we'll see this continuation of rampant urbanization. In many areas, the expansion of acres and acres of slum territory that challenge the governing system of the city or the county or the state, the nation, to actually provide services there. These can be breeding grounds for all sorts of biological and non-biological maladies. We were very much encouraged during the 1990s by the increase in democratization, the number of democracies that were established, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, in the Latin America region, and also in Africa. I would say there's good evidence over the last maybe 7 years or so that wave of democracy has peaked, and we might even be seeing challenges to it in a number of states throughout Africa and South America, at least. I wonder if regional and global institutions, without dramatic reformation, transformation, are up to these kinds of challenges. I think they've struggled since the end of the Cold War to cope with the new dynamic. The UN, NATO, any other kind of organization. So, some governments will lack the institutions, the leadership, the capacity to deal with this kind of change. And failed states or states that are suffering forms of political instability that have consequences even if the state doesn't completely collapse, I believe, is a security challenge for the future. I mentioned that we're already short in some areas of what I would call strategic resources. For me, at least, from a human level, those are energy, food, and water resources. I anticipate that we'll continue to have global economic growth, at least in major portions of the world, and that the industrialization and the expansion of economies in emerging market countries will continue to pressure resources. I would look for this as an area of sharper competition potentially in the future. You can just look at the water situation in the Central and South Asian area. Look at the disputes you see already between India and Pakistan over Indian damming and plans to dam major water systems. And you can see this is a security issue that can become a humanitarian issue. And finally, let me just say that I get to travel to a number of places throughout the world. I've, through my career, developed contacts with many foreigners, so non-Americans, from many, many backgrounds across the world. I keep regular contact with them, and I would just say over the last number of years, I have noted this tremendous increase in individual and organizational and national anxiety about the future. I'm not trying to say this applies to everyone, everywhere, but I believe it is a palpable factor that will drive the way individuals, organizations, and sometimes nations think and behave in the future. I've listed there in white some of what I think are the sources of insecurity, again, as I engage people and they describe to me why they are feeling less optimistic about the future or more insecure about the present. Again, this is a situation that can cause more spontaneous change. I think some of this insecurity is what is behind the Occupy Wall Street movement in my country. I think some of it, and the frustration it causes, is what's behind the Arab Spring. It has a capacity to generate action, is my point. Okay, so I never wanted any of the people that I worked for to look like that. That's a picture of Lucille Ball, the American actress. It was always a bad day for me if anybody in the U.S. national security establishment felt like that about a global development. I think sometimes organizations, individuals, especially those who have been successful in the past, who have grown used to the past, find it hard to imagine how the changes that I'm describing will impact them in a meaningful way that affects their daily lives or their business model. I'm not here to say it affects everybody. When I deal with corporate and government clients, I try to go through the list of questions that you see here to have them and me understand from their sense, are they comfortable with how they would answer these questions in terms of how they perceive the world, what their operational concept and model is of the world, how they do business, how they understand the past and what from the past is still relevant to the future and what is not still relevant to the future. My experience has been that core values and principles are more enduring than transient business practices and work procedures as you think about what from the past to bring forward. But the bottom line for me is if you are answering these questions in a less than optimistic way, then I would argue that you need some kind of strategic process for dealing systematically with the change that I've described. And I'm going to take a couple minutes to highlight elements of that strategic process for you, and then I'll be finished. From my perspective, there's no substitute when I think of the governmental level for what I would call integrated, systematic national security planning. Just no substitute. In fact, I would argue that that also applies on a smaller scale to global businesses. It is the only way that I know to consistently examine the future and assess the implications of the future for your enterprise, your organization. I was very encouraged to hear from both the Senator and the Admiral this notion of interagency collaboration as an imperative. In my country, after September 11th, we learned that that was absolutely an imperative, and we are still in the process of making sure that we fully integrate all of the elements of our security policy process. I'm going to give some ideas on how to do that based on my experience, just some brief ideas. And I'm very much a believer in what supports these kind of processes is a structured analytic approach to dealing with the future. And I'll highlight a couple of things without going into too much detail for this audience of what I mean by these techniques. I think the purpose of strategic planning is really to try to create the world that you seek from the world that is. Now, that's almost an impossible thing to do completely because we never can achieve the world we seek. But I think at the bottom of the slide, I think what the process can provide is any organization or government a capacity to make better decisions today about the future, to have a broader set of options to deal with surprises and unexpected developments as they emerge, and to be more resilient to be able to suffer some of the implications of strategic change, but still have your organization, your entity, your country intact. That, to me, is the value of this. It's enabling the decision and the resiliency processes. The goal is still create and shape the world. I don't think you can do this every once in a while, like every 5 years or 10 years, say that you go through a strategic planning process. My experience is that it has to be dedicated, systematic, continuous, rigorous, if it's going to have any kind of impact that's lasting, that's enduring, that's consequential. I think it's very important, and again, I was encouraged by some of the prior comments to think about scope. In my country, up until September 11th, we typically thought about national security as a foreign policy issue. Part of that was our history. We generally had two oceans protecting us. We could consider national strategic policy in that foreign policy context. After September 11th, we recognized our homeland was vulnerable, and we expanded our concept of national security to include protecting the homeland against terrorist and other kinds of threats. So looking at our infrastructure and the vulnerabilities there, and being able to protect our citizens and infrastructure. More recently, living through the global economic crisis, we've come to realize that there's another dimension centered around rebuilding or renewing the homeland, focused on our educational system, rebuilding our infrastructure, protecting our borders. So now it's a multidimensional, very broad concept of what constitutes national security and national security policy and planning. That's for you to decide in terms of what that means in the Italian context. I also think it's important to determine time frame. I would only say here, if your time frame is too short, no matter how strategic your thoughts are, your actions will turn tactical. If your time frame is too long, you'll be irrelevant to the process. So you have to pick a time frame that is relevant to your decision process, to the issues that you face. And it's important, I think, to get that right. I believe you need a comprehensive, objective evaluation of the strategic environment, domestic, regional, global, if it affects you. This has to be objective. It can't just be the world that you would like to see. It has to be the world that you are dealing with. I think at that point you can begin to establish objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you prioritizing? I think it's important that those objectives line up with your enduring values and interests. And you also, at some point, have to consider resources and the limitations resources will propose. At that point, I think you can develop a strategy. That strategy will almost certainly need to be readjusted over time, and so I think it's important to have metrics that allow you to decide, am I achieving my strategy at a pace that is acceptable to me? I won't go into detail here, but I think it's important to actually have a foundational underpinning for building strategic collaboration. And so when I talk about principles and core principles, I think those are the fundamental elements that provide the foundation for collaboration. Things like focusing on a common objective, a willingness to have a unified command and submit everyone to that command. I also think there are core values that are more individual values, the kinds of characteristics you need to have to be able to engage in a collaborative way. I think it's impossible to think about the future without using scenarios. They're excellent when you're dealing with complex issues that are set in the future that haven't happened yet, where there is great uncertainty. It gives you a means for strategic dialogue and to examine the implications of multiple futures. When I talk about scenarios, I am envisioning stories about the future events that have been created in your mind that you are then examining the implications of. It's the heart of the strategic planning process and the global security evaluation process from my perspective. I think you have to rely on elements and capabilities beyond your own organization to build expert teams that have these characteristics, can cover a diverse set of topics with a diverse and multicultural, ethnic set of perspectives, professional set of perspectives, some political savvy, and this is really a problem-solving exercise, so I would look for problem-solving experience and skills. I've been undermined by experts many times in my career, so I'm very suspicious of experts. When I bring experts in for a team, I try in a structured way to engage them, to understand what they know, what they think, why they think that. So I just posit here a set of questions that I think are important for policymakers, for analysts to examine, to ask themselves, and to ask the experts that they interact with, so that you can understand, are they as confident or are they more confident than they should be? If you're not aware, the picture there is of the U.S. President Harry Truman. It's the morning after the 1950 presidential election. The Chicago Tribune in America went to bed, the Chicago Tribune's an American newspaper, went to bed believing that Truman's opponent had won and actually announced that Truman's opponent had won, and so President Truman got the last laugh there. But it's a good caution for when you're dealing with experts, they can be wrong. Finally, I think you can't do a strategic evaluation and assessment and then mitigation of the future without having some equivalent to a risk warning process that has the dimensions that I highlight in yellow here. Many organizations have a capacity to identify existing threats. Fewer have a capacity to anticipate new challenges. I think many times we identify threats but don't comprehensively evaluate them. Once they're evaluated, they need to be monitored. The threat level, the risk level needs to be communicated, and mitigation strategies have to be developed. So thank you for your attention. I hope to answer questions that may have arisen in our follow-up session.